There's a silent war being waged inside of you, between who you are and who you had to become to survive. Most of us don't even realize it. We go through life believing that we're choosing freely, that our reactions and preferences are entirely our own. But in reality, much of our behavior is driven by a force that is rarely seen and often misunderstood: the ego. In modern spirituality and even psychology, the ego has become a kind of villain, a word we use to explain arrogance, selfishness, or unconscious defense mechanisms. Kill the ego, they say, transcend it. But Carl Jung saw it differently. For him, the ego wasn't evil. It was essential. It was the organizing principle of the psyche, the center of consciousness, and the first shield we build to protect ourselves from a world that can be harsh, unpredictable, and deeply painful. The ego is not your enemy. It's your first responder. It's the part of you that stepped up when you were too young, too hurt, or too overwhelmed to process reality. It created stories to make sense of trauma. It formed identities to keep you safe. It told you who you had to be in order to be loved, to be accepted, to be enough. And while those adaptations might no longer serve you, they once saved you. That's the paradox. What once protected you can now imprison you. But here's the truth. Healing doesn't mean destroying the ego. It means understanding it. It means sitting with the frightened child behind the mask, listening to what it's been trying to say all along. Because the ego doesn't want to hurt you. It just doesn't know who you'd be without it. And that's exactly where your transformation begins. So if you've ever felt stuck in patterns you can't explain, if you've ever noticed yourself sabotaging your own growth, or if you've ever wondered why it's so hard to let go of control, then this journey is for you. Because the moment you stop blaming the ego and start listening to it, is the moment your soul begins to speak. Imagine the ego not as a villain, but as the gatekeeper of your consciousness. It's not there to sabotage your growth. It's there to organize your experience of reality. In Jungian psychology, the ego is the center of the field of consciousness. It's the part of you that says, I am. It draws the boundary between what is me and what is not me. Without this organizing principle, we would drown in chaos. From childhood, the ego begins to shape itself by identifying what's acceptable, what's lovable, and what gets rejected. It learns from your environment, your caregivers, your culture, and it becomes the mask you wear to navigate the world. This isn't inherently bad. In fact, it's necessary. The problem arises when we mistake the mask for the face beneath it. The ego develops not out of malice, but out of necessity. It's the psychic immune system, filtering experiences, defending the psyche, and constructing a sense of continuity. You need an ego to function, to plan, to speak, to remember who you are in space and time. But while the ego keeps you grounded, in the material world it also has blind spots. It is, by definition, limited. It cannot see what lies in the unconscious. It protects you by excluding things that might overwhelm you: painful memories, uncomfortable truths, unmet needs. The ego doesn't want to destroy you. It wants to preserve the identity it worked so hard to build. And in doing so, it sometimes becomes rigid, defensive, and afraid of change. But that's not because it's evil. It's because it's scared. Think of the ego like a loyal guard dog. It watches the perimeter of your psyche, barking at anything unfamiliar. Trauma? Bark. Vulnerability? Bark. Authentic expression that contradicts the identity you've built? Bark. But the dog isn't the enemy. It's trying to keep you safe, based on what it was trained to believe was dangerous. If you grew up in an environment where expressing emotion led to punishment, the ego learned to suppress emotion. If love was conditional, the ego adapted by becoming what others needed you to be. These aren't flaws, they are adaptive responses. The ego learned these roles not to hurt you, but to help you survive. The deeper question is, are those roles still serving you? Understanding the ego means looking beyond judgment. It means seeing it for what it is, a brilliant but outdated operating system. It got you through the hardest moments of your life. It gave you identity when you had none. But like any system, it needs updates. The journey of individuation, the central goal of Jungian psychology, is not to erase the ego, but to bring it into harmony with the deeper self. When we see the ego as a guardian rather than a jailer, we begin to approach ourselves with compassion instead of shame. And that shift from conflict to curiosity opens the door to true inner transformation, because only when you understand what the ego is trying to protect can you begin to show it that it's safe to evolve. The ego doesn't emerge all at once. It's not something you're born with, it's something you construct. In the early years of life, you exist in a kind of psychological oneness with the world. There is no clear boundary between self and other. But as you begin to experience separation, being told no, feeling fear, witnessing disapproval, your psyche begins to build a structure to manage this complexity. That structure is the ego. It forms as a response to discomfort, as a way to create predictability in a world that feels overwhelming. Each time you're praised for something, the ego notes it. This is who I need to be. Each time you're punished or ignored, the ego takes that too. This is what I must never become. In this way, the ego is built brick by brick, not from authenticity, but from adaptation. Carl Jung understood that the ego is not the whole of the self. It's merely a part. But it becomes dominant because it develops in response to the world. Your soul may whisper in symbols, images, and intuition, but your ego shouts in language, in rules, in learned behavior. As a child, your primary need is safety and belonging, not self-actualization. So you unconsciously begin to sculpt a version of yourself that keeps you accepted. If being quiet earned love, the ego formed a quiet identity. If being strong meant survival, the ego rejected weakness. These early psychic contracts are powerful. You're not aware you've made them, but you live by them. The ego becomes your protector, your negotiator, your builder of masks. And with time, the mask becomes the only face you recognize. But here's the paradox. The stronger the ego becomes, the more it forgets its own origin story. It starts to believe that it is the self, not a creation, but a truth. This is where much of our suffering begins. We cling to identities that were built to protect us long after the threat is gone. A child who had to be perfect to be loved grows into an adult who can't rest. A boy who was punished for crying becomes a man who doesn't know how to feel. The ego keeps defending against threats that no longer exist. It's as if a soldier continues to patrol the battlefield, not realizing the war ended years ago. But that's what makes ego work so difficult. You're not just challenging thoughts, you're challenging the very structure that once kept you safe from emotional death. Understanding how the ego was born helps you soften your resistance to it. You stop asking, "Why am I like this?" and start asking, "When did I first learn to be this way?" That shift opens a doorway to healing. You begin to trace the outlines of the defense system you've built, realizing that every overreaction, every shutdown, every compulsive need to control came from a time when you didn't feel safe. This is the beginning of what Jung called shadow work, not destroying the ego, but uncovering what it's been hiding, what it's been afraid of. Because once you can see the blueprint of how your ego was constructed, you can begin to redesign it, not with fear, but with intention. And not to defend yourself from life, but to support you as you finally begin to live it. To the ego, change is not just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. Remember, the ego was built in response to early, emotional survival needs. Its job is to keep things predictable, manageable, and familiar. Even if your current patterns are painful or dysfunctional, the ego prefers the known pain to the unknown possibility. Why? Because it equates familiarity with safety. Every identity, every behavior, every thought loop you've repeated for years becomes part of the ego's internal map. And when something threatens that map, whether it's a new relationship, a spiritual awakening, or the desire to break a toxic pattern, the ego sounds the alarm. "Don't go there," it whispers. "It's not safe." This isn't self-sabotage in the malicious sense. It's a primitive defense mechanism rooted in the fear of losing control. Carl Jung knew that real transformation doesn't come from comfort. It comes from a kind of psychic death. The ego, however, resists this death with all its might. That's why even small changes, setting boundaries, expressing vulnerability, leaving a job that defines you, can feel like inner war. The ego frames these changes as threats to your very existence. You might feel intense anxiety, guilt, or confusion when trying to evolve. This is the ego's way of protecting the self-image it has spent years constructing. It's terrified that if you let go of that image, you'll become nothing. But the truth is, growth isn't annihilation, it's integration. You're not becoming someone else, you're becoming more you. But to the ego, more you is uncharted territory. And so it resists, often violently, in the name of keeping you safe. One of the most revealing signs of ego resistance is the voice of inner doubt. That voice might say, "You'll fail," "People won't like you," or "You're not ready." It's not just fear, it's identity preservation. If your ego is built around being the helper, for instance, and you decide to stop pleasing everyone, that change is perceived as a betrayal of self. Or if your ego is built on being the achiever, resting or slowing down may trigger shame and panic. What's really happening is that your ego fears obsolescence. It doesn't understand that its role can evolve, that it can move from controller to companion. But until that shift occurs, every step toward healing will feel like rebellion, and rebellion to the ego is chaos. So it does what it does best. It resists, criticizes, and clings. Ironically, the ego's resistance to change often prolongs suffering. You stay in relationships that drain you, careers that deaden you, or roles that suffocate you, not because you truly want to, but because your ego has mistaken them for your identity. But no structure, no matter how carefully built, should become a prison. Jung believed that the ego must be confronted but not crushed. Its fears must be heard, its stories explored, and its loyalty acknowledged. Because the more compassion you bring to your ego, the less it needs to defend itself. When the ego begins to trust that change won't lead to destruction, but to expansion, it can begin to soften. And in that softening, a space opens, a space where your deeper self, the one beyond fear and control, can finally begin to emerge. The ego is a necessary structure, but it is not your essence. It is who you became in order to be accepted, but not necessarily who you are. Carl Jung often pointed to the split between the ego and the self as one of the great causes of human suffering. Over time, as the ego builds its identity, it begins to disconnect you from your deeper truth. You learn to play roles: caretaker, overachiever, rebel, peacemaker. These roles might have brought you love, praise, or a sense of control. But beneath them lies a self that never had the space to emerge. This is the false self that psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott also spoke of, a version of you that is more performance than presence. And the more we identify with it, the more we forget that something real still waits underneath. The tragedy is that the ego isn't lying to hurt you. It believes the role it plays is your truth. If your ego believes you are only lovable when you succeed, it will drive you to exhaustion. If it believes vulnerability equals weakness, it will harden your heart. These scripts become automatic. You wake up each day not as a free being, but as a character following an old rigid script, and while the world might applaud that character, call it admirable, strong, or selfless, you can feel the quiet ache of disconnection. You're playing the part perfectly, but something inside you feels hollow, unseen. That feeling isn't failure, it's a signal. It's your essence trying to break through the surface, whispering that you were never meant to be a role. You were meant to be real. This false self isn't evil, it's protective. It was born the moment your authenticity became too risky. Perhaps as a child, you expressed a truth and were met with silence, punishment, or shame. The ego took note and said never again. From then on, it built layers, armor disguised as identity, and because this armor helped you survive, you began to believe it was you. But the true self, the one that laughs freely, cries openly, and exists without justification, was never destroyed. It was simply buried. And the longer it remains buried, the more life begins to feel like performance art, exhausting, disconnected, and painfully hollow. Jung believed that individuation is the journey back to that essence, not by destroying the ego, but by peeling back the layers it built around your soul. Reclaiming your essence isn't an act of ego death, it's an act of deep inner remembering. You're not erasing who you've been, you're rediscovering who you were before the world told you who to be. This is where shadow work becomes essential, not to shame the false self, but to recognize it, thank it, and gently begin to disidentify from it. You realize that you are not the persona you perform. You are not the achievements, the roles, or the image. You are the one beneath all that, the one who is scared, curious, longing, alive. The ego may resist this truth because it fears irrelevance. But as you begin to embody your essence, something remarkable happens. The ego doesn't die. It relaxes. It begins to serve you rather than control you. And in that moment, the false self begins to dissolve, revealing the sacred truth it was. Built to protect. When the ego feels unsafe, it doesn't shout. It strategizes. It starts building defenses. But unlike physical walls, these defenses are internal patterns of thought and behavior, subtle enough to feel normal and even virtuous. Perfectionism, for instance, often hides behind the mask of excellence. Control masquerades as responsibility. Overthinking disguises itself as intelligence. But beneath these traits lies fear. Fear of failure, rejection, abandonment, chaos. Jung understood that the ego uses these defenses not to be malicious, but to preserve the sense of identity it has worked so hard to create. If your identity is built around being the capable one, then failure becomes a threat to your entire self-concept. So the ego builds a perfectionist wall, unscalable, exhausting, and brittle. And over time, that wall doesn't just keep failure out, it traps you inside. Control is perhaps the ego's favorite defense. When we were children, we had no real control over our environment. If a parent left, if love was withdrawn, if something traumatic occurred, we internalized a terrifying truth: the world is unpredictable. The ego cannot accept this. It steps in to create the illusion of control, rigid routines, obsessive planning, hypervigilance. But this control comes at a cost. Life becomes smaller, tighter, more brittle. We begin to fear spontaneity, vulnerability, and surrender, not because they're dangerous, but because they threaten the ego's illusion of safety. Overthinking is a similar strategy. It gives us a false sense of mastery over life. The ego convinces us that if we analyze enough, anticipate enough, prepare enough, we can avoid pain. But thinking is not the same as feeling, and analysis does not equal healing. Perfectionism, too, is a deeply misunderstood ego defense. At its core, it's not about high standards. It's about avoiding shame. Somewhere along the way, the ego learned that love had to be earned and flaws were punishable. So it began to craft an identity that was flawless, polished, always together. But this perfection becomes a cage. You start living not as a human being, but as a performance of invulnerability. Mistakes don't feel like feedback. They feel like proof of unworthiness. And so the cycle tightens. You overwork, over-edit, overcompensate. You become terrified of being truly seen, because being seen would mean revealing the cracks in the persona. Jung's work invites us to realize the goal is not to transcend imperfection, but to embrace our wholeness, which includes the parts we were taught to hide. The tragedy of ego defenses is that they often succeed at first. You avoid rejection. You get praise. You stay in control. But over time, they begin to cost you your aliveness. You become anxious, burned out, emotionally numb. You stop trusting yourself, others, even life itself. Jung believed that healing requires us to see the function behind the defense. Instead of attacking perfectionism, ask, what pain is it trying to avoid? Instead of shaming yourself for overthinking, ask, what emotion am I afraid to feel? These questions shift us from self-judgment to self-compassion. The ego doesn't need punishment. It needs reassurance. It needs to know that who you truly are is allowed to exist, even if you're messy, uncertain, and full of contradictions. And when the defenses are no longer needed, they begin to dissolve, not through force, but through safety. At first glance, the ego seems like an ally, building identity, keeping us safe, helping us navigate a world that often feels chaotic. But as Jung taught, every light casts a shadow. What begins as protection can quietly evolve into imprisonment. When the ego becomes too dominant, too rigid, it no longer serves the self. It begins to suppress it. The same perfectionism that helped you gain approval starts to steal your joy. The same vigilance that protected you from past pain now stops you from opening your heart. The ego doesn't know when to stop. It was designed to defend, and so it defends everything, even the walls it built long ago. The tragedy is that it begins to defend you from your own growth, your own authenticity, and from the parts of you that don't fit the narrative it created. And in doing so, it becomes the very force it once protected you from. This is the shadow side of the ego. It fears the unknown so deeply that it prefers a painful known to a liberating mystery. It keeps you repeating toxic patterns, staying in roles that no longer fit, and denying truths that ache to be expressed. Why? Because change requires surrender, and surrender feels like death to the ego. Jung believed that transformation often begins with a crisis, because only when the ego's strategies start to collapse do we begin to question their validity. This collapse can feel terrifying. Anxiety, depression, identity confusion, all signs that the ego's control is cracking. But what seems like breaking down is often breaking open. The false self starts to lose its grip, and something deeper begins to stir, not destruction, but rebirth. Still, the ego will resist this shift with everything it has. It wants certainty, not freedom. Ironically, the more the ego tries to maintain control, the more it creates the very suffering it's trying to avoid. By keeping you small, it amplifies your restlessness. By suppressing emotion, it deepens your numbness. By clinging to roles, it cuts you off from intimacy. You might look like you have it all together on the outside, successful, composed, dependable, yet feel a gnawing emptiness on the inside. This is the cost of living from the shadow of the ego. You trade aliveness for safety, authenticity for performance, and over time, that trade begins to erode your sense of meaning. You start asking existential questions, not because something is wrong, but because something true is trying to emerge. And it can't emerge until you face what the ego is unwilling to see, that its protection has become limitation. But facing this shadow doesn't mean annihilating the ego. That's a misunderstanding, and often a dangerous one. Jung was clear. The goal is not to kill the ego, but to integrate it, to bring its unconscious fears into awareness, to listen to the inner child behind the defenses, to understand why those walls were built, and to gently begin taking them down where they no longer serve. Integration means learning to hold both. Truths, yes, the ego once kept you safe, and yes, now it may be holding you back. This dual awareness creates space to breathe, to feel, to imagine who you are outside of survival. And when you begin to see the shadow not as an enemy but as a teacher, something profound happens. You stop living in reaction, and you begin living in relation to yourself, to your pain, and to the wholeness that was never truly lost, only hidden. There's a voice inside us, subtle, persistent, often brutal. It says things like, "You're not enough, you always mess things up," or "Why can't you be better?" We call it the inner critic. But this voice isn't random. It has a history, a function, and a deep connection to the ego. To understand where this voice comes from, we have to look back to early childhood. As we grew, we absorbed the judgments, expectations, and emotional reactions of our caregivers and environment. The ego, trying desperately to keep us safe and accepted, internalized these voices. If I criticize myself first, it reasoned, I can avoid being shamed by others. What began as protection soon became a pattern. The inner critic isn't just an enemy, it's the echo of a survival strategy. And until we bring it into consciousness, it will continue to shape how we see ourselves. Jung taught that the ego is a mediator. It organizes consciousness. But when it becomes entangled with shame, it turns inward on itself. The inner critic becomes its instrument. It doesn't whisper truths, it projects fear. And yet we believe it because it speaks in our own voice. This is one of the most insidious aspects of the ego's shadow. It makes us mistake conditioning for identity. If your early experiences taught you that love was conditional, the inner critic will monitor every move you make, ensuring you stay good enough to be accepted. It's exhausting, demoralizing, and isolating, but it's also familiar, and the ego thrives on the familiar, even if it hurts. We end up mistaking self-attack for self-awareness. We think we're being realistic, when in fact we're just reenacting old emotional scripts that no longer serve us. The inner critic often appears most intensely during moments of growth. Right before you express a boundary, right after you try something new, right when you feel joy, vulnerability, or expansion. That's not coincidence. It's the ego's alarm system going off. You're stepping outside the role, it warns. This is unsafe. And so it sends in the critic to pull you back into the identity it knows. The more powerful the breakthrough, the louder the backlash, not because you're failing, but because you're evolving. And the ego doesn't. Yet trust that evolution is safe. That voice in your head isn't proof of your inadequacy. It's a sign that you're entering territory the ego doesn't control. This is why healing isn't about silencing the critic, but understanding it. Listening to its fear, tracing it back to its origin, and gently offering it something it's never known, compassion. Jung's work invites us to differentiate between the self and the ego, not to destroy one, but to free the other. The inner critic is not your soul's voice. It's the ego's attempt to protect you through control and self-policing. And once you see it for what it is, a defense, not a truth, you can begin to soften your relationship to it. That doesn't mean pretending it's not there. It means meeting it with curiosity. Whose voice is this? What is it trying to protect me from? What does this part of me need to feel safe enough to relax? These questions shift you out of identification and into dialogue. And the more you practice this, the less power the critic holds. Eventually, the ego learns that it no longer needs to criticize to be heard. It can rest, it can trust, and in that trust, the real you, the one beneath the voice, finally has room to breathe. In spiritual and psychological circles, there's a common misconception that the ego is the enemy, that to evolve, we must destroy it, silence it, transcend it. But Carl Jung saw the ego not as something to eliminate, but something to integrate. The ego is not evil, it's limited. And those limitations are often rooted in fear, past trauma, or survival instinct. To attack the ego is to misunderstand it. You don't heal by waging war on your inner protector. You heal by making it conscious. Integration doesn't mean erasing the ego's influence. It means building a bridge between ego and self. It means seeing your patterns, defenses, and roles not as flaws, but as signals. Signals pointing you toward the places that still need understanding, compassion, and transformation. Fighting the ego only strengthens its grip. But witnessing it? That's what loosens it. The ego is deeply relational. It was formed in relationship, and it must be healed in relationship, not just with others, but with yourself. When you react with judgment to your ego's behaviors, your perfectionism, your defensiveness, your pride, you create more fragmentation. You split yourself further into good and bad, spiritual and egotistical. This is not integration. Integration is sitting beside the part of you that wants to control and asking, what are you afraid of? It's hearing the answer, not with the goal of fixing it, but of understanding it. Jung knew that wholeness includes the contradictions. The ego doesn't need to be purified, it needs to be seen. And when you truly see your ego, not through the lens of shame, but through the eyes of the self, something alchemical happens. The protector begins to soften because it finally feels safe to rest. There's a paradox at the heart of inner work. The more you try to push something away, the more it clings to you. This is especially true with the ego. If you judge it as bad, you suppress it. But suppression is not integration, it's avoidance. And what you avoid becomes shadow. This is how spiritual bypassing is born. The ego gets pushed underground and resurfaces as arrogance masked as enlightenment, or denial masquerading as peace. True growth requires you to turn toward the very things you'd rather ignore, to look at your need to be right, your fear of vulnerability, your hunger for validation, not with guilt, but with radical honesty. This is not weakness, it is courage. Jung called this the path of individuation, the sacred process of becoming who you truly are by reconciling all that you've been. Not just the light, but the shadow. Not just the soul, but the ego too. Integration is a lifelong process. It's not a one-time awakening, but a series of small, consistent acts of inner relationship. It's catching yourself in a defensive spiral and choosing curiosity over critique. It's feeling the ego panic and saying, I hear you, I know. You're scared, but we don't need that armor anymore. These moments may seem quiet, almost invisible to the outside world, but internally, they are revolutions. Over time, your ego learns that it is not being abandoned, it is being reoriented. No longer the ruler, but a trusted advisor. No longer the mask, but a voice in the chorus of your being. This is the deeper meaning of Jung's work. That wholeness is not perfection, but integration. You don't evolve by cutting off parts of yourself. You evolve by bringing them home. And when the ego becomes part of the larger self, your inner world shifts from conflict to coherence, from fear to trust. The ego was born out of necessity, a psychological construct that helped you survive the chaos of early life. But often it carries old wounds and outdated beliefs about who you are and how you must behave to be safe and loved. Reparenting the ego means recognizing that it's like a frightened child inside you, still clinging to survival strategies that may no longer serve you. This process asks you to step into the role of a compassionate parent, not to punish or Dismiss the ego, but to understand and nurture it. Imagine the ego as a scared child seeking safety and reassurance. When you meet it with kindness instead of criticism, you begin to rewrite the internal narrative. You say to yourself, "You don't have to protect me this way anymore. I am here now. You can relax." This is the beginning of true healing. Reparenting is not about erasing the ego's presence. It's about giving it a new role, one that supports rather than controls. Instead of being the gatekeeper that blocks growth, the ego becomes a guide that helps you navigate life's complexities with awareness and balance. You teach your ego that vulnerability is not weakness, imperfection is not shameful, and mistakes are part of learning. This shift doesn't happen overnight. It requires patience and repeated acts of self-compassion. Whenever the ego feels threatened and reverts to old patterns of defense, you gently remind it, "It's okay. You are safe. We are in this together." Over time, this new relationship softens the ego's grip, creating space for more authentic expression and greater psychological freedom. Jung's concept of individuation is deeply connected to this process of reparenting. Individuation is the journey toward becoming your whole self, integrating all parts of your psyche, including the ego and its shadows. Reparenting allows the ego to evolve from a defensive structure into a trusted partner in that journey. This partnership fosters inner harmony. The ego no longer dominates or suppresses the soul. It learns to listen and support. This transformation helps break patterns of self-criticism, anxiety, and disconnection that many of us carry unconsciously. The more you nurture your ego with understanding, the more it learns to trust the unfolding of your true nature. It's a dance between holding on and letting go, between protection and freedom. Ultimately, reparenting the ego is an act of radical self-love. It acknowledges that your ego's fears are valid, but that you are more than those fears. It affirms your inherent worthiness beyond achievements, roles, or external validation. This process can feel vulnerable and challenging because it requires you to face parts of yourself you might have long ignored or rejected. But it also brings immense relief and empowerment. When the ego feels genuinely cared for, it relaxes its defenses and allows your deeper self, the soul, to emerge more fully. This is not a one-time fix, but a lifelong practice of kindness and presence. Jung's wisdom reminds us the ego isn't the enemy. It's a part of us that needs healing, understanding, and a new role in the story of who we are. The ego, in its relentless quest to protect, often creates noise, fear, judgment, resistance that drowns out the subtler voice of the soul. Jung believed that the soul speaks softly and requires silence to be heard. But when the ego is tense, defensive, or controlling, it blocks this delicate communication. The moment the ego begins to relax, when it stops struggling to maintain rigid control or self-protection, something extraordinary happens. The soul's voice breaks through. This voice is not loud or demanding. It is a quiet, persistent call toward authenticity, meaning, and wholeness. It invites you into a deeper dialogue with yourself, one that honors complexity and paradox instead of demanding simple answers or constant certainty. When the ego surrenders its grip, you gain access to a richer, more vibrant inner life. Relaxation of the ego doesn't mean passivity or loss of self. Instead, it's a conscious choice to step out of survival mode and into presence. It's the space where intuition, creativity, and deep knowing emerge. Jung described this as the process of individuation, the integration of all parts of the psyche into a cohesive whole. When the ego eases its control, the boundaries between conscious and unconscious soften. Symbols, dreams, and insights from the soul become accessible. This process can be unsettling because it involves surrendering familiar structures. Yet it is also deeply liberating. The soul's voice offers guidance that transcends fear-based thinking, reminding you of your intrinsic worth and connection to something greater. In this space, true healing and transformation occur. The ego's relaxation is often triggered by trust. Trust in life, trust in oneself, trust in the unknown. But trust is hard-won. It requires patience, vulnerability, and courage. When you practice compassionate self-awareness, you create an environment where the ego feels safe enough to loosen its grip. You stop reacting defensively and start responding from a place of inner calm. This shift allows the soul's voice to emerge not as a faint whisper, but as a steady presence that shapes your thoughts, feelings, and actions. The journey is not about perfect control, but about graceful surrender. It's about learning to dance with uncertainty and complexity rather than resisting them. When the ego relaxes, the soul's wisdom can finally guide your path. This process is deeply personal, but also universal. Jung's insights remind us that the ego's protective function is vital but not all-encompassing. The soul represents the larger self, the transcendent core that holds the potential for wholeness. When the ego steps back, it creates the space for the soul to speak, inviting healing, purpose, and connection. This is the promise of Jungian psychology, not the eradication of the ego, but its transformation. A transformation that allows you to live more fully, more authentically, and with greater peace. So, when you notice the ego tightening, remember, it's trying to protect you. But invite it to relax. And in that relaxation, listen closely. The soul is waiting to speak. The journey we've explored is not about defeating the ego, but about befriending it, understanding its fears, honoring its intentions, and guiding it toward a new purpose. Carl Jung showed us that the ego is not the villain lurking inside us. It's the guardian of our identity, shaped by our earliest experiences and survival needs. It's imperfect, yes, and often limited, but fundamentally trying to protect us from harm, even if that protection sometimes feels like a prison. When we stop fighting the ego and instead invite it into dialogue, we open the door to healing. We recognize that its harsh voices, the inner critic, the fears, the compulsions, are echoes of past wounds, not absolute truths. Through patience, compassion, and conscious awareness, we can reparent the ego, give it a role that serves our growth rather than restricts it. And in the spaciousness that follows, something extraordinary happens. The soul, the deepest, most authentic part of ourselves, can finally speak. The soul's voice is gentle but persistent, guiding us toward wholeness, creativity, and true freedom. This is the essence of Jung's message: integration, not eradication; harmony, not division. So as you walk this path, remember, your ego is not your enemy. It is a vital part of your psyche that wants to keep you safe. When you listen deeply, with kindness and understanding, you empower both your ego and your soul to work together. And in that sacred partnership, you find the space to become truly whole.